Hey y'all, how you doing today? I am a little sore. If you kind of heard in the last one, I went hunting a couple of days ago, and for some reason, not the day after you do a lot of exercise, but the day after the day that you do a lot of exercise, you are sore, more sore than you are if you don't get out and work. And so I am sore. I thought I was sore yesterday. I thought I was exhausted yesterday, but I am sore today. Anyway, we are on Les Mis by Victor Hugo, book 1 of the Fantine series, chapter 4. So let's go ahead here. Let's go ahead and get on with chapter 4. His conversation was cheerful and pleasant. He adapted himself to the level of the two old women who lived with him. But when he laughed, it was a schoolboy's laughter. Madame Magloire sometimes called him Your Highness. One day, rising from his armchair, he went to his library for a book. It was on one of the upper shelves, and as the bishop was rather short, he could not reach it. Madame Magloire, he said, bring me a chair. My Highness cannot reach that shelf. One of his distant relatives, the Countess of Low, rarely missed an occasion to enumerate in his presence what she called the expectations of her 3 sons. She had several relatives, very old and near death, of whom her sons were their legal heirs. The youngest of the 3 was to receive from a great aunt 100,000 livres in income. The second was to take his uncle's title of duke. The eldest would succeed to the peerage of his grandfather. The bishop customarily listened in silence to these innocent and pardonable maternal displays. Once, however, he appeared more absent-minded than usual while Madame de Lowe went through all the successions and expectations. Stopping suddenly, with some impatience, she exclaimed, My goodness, cousin, what are you thinking about? I'm thinking, he replied, of something odd from, I believe, Saint Augustine. Place your expectations in him to whom there is no succession. On another occasion, has he read a letter announcing the death of a gentleman from nearby and listing at great length not only the high positions of the departed, but also the feudal and titular honors of all his relatives. He exclaimed, What a broad back death has! What a marvelous load of titles will he cheerfully carry! And what stamina must men have who use the tomb to feed their vanity? At times, he used gentle raillery, almost always charged with serious meaning. Once, during Lent, a young vicar came to Denis and preached in the cathedral. The subject of his sermon was charity, and he treated it very eloquently. He called upon the rich to give alms to the poor, if they were to escape the tortures of hell, which he pictured in the most fearful colors, and enter paradise, which he portrayed as desirable and inviting. There was a wealthy, retired merchant at the service, somewhat inclined to usury, a M. Gebrand, who had accumulated an estimate of 2 million from manufacturing coarse cloth and woolens. Never in all his life had M. Gebrand given alms to the unfortunate. But from the day of this sermon, it was noticed that regularly every Sunday he gave a penny to the old beggar woman at the door of the cathedral. There were 6 of them to share it. One day the bishop, seeing him perform this act of charity, said to his sister with a smile, There's Monsieur Gibrand buying a pennyworth of paradise. When soliciting aid for any charity, he was never silenced by a refusal. He was never at a loss for words that would set the hearers thinking. One day, he was seeking alms for the poor in a salon gathering, where the Marquis de Champcer, old, rich, and miserly, was present. The Marquis managed to be, at the same time, an ultra-royalist and an ultra-Voltairean, a species of which he was not the only representative. Coming to him in his turn, the bishop touched his arm and said, "Monsieur de Marquis, you must give me something." The Marquis turned and answered drily, "Monseigneur, I have my own poor." "Give them to me," the bishop said. One day he preached the sermon to the cathedral. "Dearest brethren, my good friends, in France there are 1,320,000 peasants' cottages that have only 3 openings, 1,817,000 that have 2, the door and 1 window, and finally 346,000 cabins with only 1, the door. And this is because of the tax on doors and windows. Imagine poor families, aged women and small children living in these huts, and think of the fever and disease. Alas, God gives light to men, and the law sells it. I do not blame the law, but I bless God. In Ussuri, in the Var, and in the Upper and Lower Alps, the peasants do not even have wheelbarrows. They carry the manure on their backs. They have no candles, but burn pine knots and bits of rope soaked in pitch. And in the same is true all through the Upper Dauphiné. They make bread once in 6 months and bake it by the heat of dried cow dung. In the winter, they have to break it with an axe and soak it in water for 24 hours before they can eat it. My brethren, be compassionate. See how much suffering there is around you." Born a provincial, he had familiarized himself with all the dialects of the South. He would say, "Eh, be, monsieur se sage," as in Lower Languedoc, "Haute Entrepasse," as in the Lower Alps, "Porte un bueno monte en be, un buenen formage grasse," as in the Upper Daphne. This pleased the people and contributed not a little to giving him ready access to their hearts. He was equally at home in a cottage and on the mountains. He could say the loftiest things in the simplest language, and as he could speak all dialects, his words penetrated every soul. He behaved the same with the rich as with the poor. He condemned nothing hastily, and without taking account of circumstances, he would say, "Let's see how the fault crept in." Being, as he smilingly described himself, an ex-sinner, he had none of the inaccessibility of a rigid mortality, and would boldly profess, without the raised eyebrows of the ferociously virtuous, a doctrine that might be loosely summarized as follows: Man has a body that is both his burden and his temptation. He drags it along and gives into it. He ought to watch over it, keep it in bounds, repress it, and obey it only as a last resort. It may be wrong to obey even then, but if so, the fault is venal. It is a fall, but a fall onto the knees, which may end in prayer. To be a saint is the exception. To be upright is the rule. Falter, sin, but be upright. To commit the least possible sin is the law for man. To live entirely without sin is the dream of an angel. Everything on this earth is subject to sin. Sin is like gravity. When he heard people raising a hue and cry, easily finding fault, "Oh ho," he would say with a smile, "it would seem that this is a great crime that every one commits. See how offended hypocrisy is quick to protest and run for cover." He was indulgent toward women and the poor, upon whom the weight of society falls most heavily. He would say, "The faults of women, children, and servants, and of the weak, the indigent, and the ignorant, are the faults of their husbands, fathers, and masters, of the strong, the rich, and the wise." Or, he would say, "Teach the ignorant as much as you can. Society is guilty in not providing universal free education, and it must for the night it produces. If the soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but the one who causes the darkness." Clearly, he had his own strange way of judging things. I suspect he acquired it from the Gospels. In a saloon one day, he heard an account of a criminal cease about to be tried. A miserable man, because of love for a woman and the child she had bore him, had been making counterfeit coins, his real money gone. At that time, counterfeiting was still punished by death. The woman was arrested for passing the first piece he made. She was held prisoner, but there was no proof against her lover. She alone could testify against him and lose him through her confession. She denied his guilt. They insisted, but she was obstinate in her denial. At that point, the king's state prosecutor devised a shrewd plan. He maintained that her lover was unfaithful, and by means of fragments of letters skillfully put together, succeeded in persuading the unfortunate woman that she had a rival and that the man had deceived her. Inflamed with jealousy, she denounced her lover, confessed everything, and proved his guilt. He was to be tried in a few days, at Aix. With his accomplice, and his conviction was certain. The story was told and retold, and everybody was delighted by the magistrate's cleverness, bringing jealousy into play. He had brought truth to light by means of anger, and justice had sprung from revenge. The bishop listened to all this in silence. When it was finished, he asked, "Where are this man and woman to be tried?" "At the superior court." "And where is the king's prosecutor to be tried?" A tragic event occurred in Denis. A man had been condemned to death for murder. The unfortunate prisoner was a poorly educated but not entirely ignorant man who had been a juggler at fairs and a public letter writer. The townspeople were fascinated with the trial. The evening before the day appointed for the execution of the condemned, the prison chaplain fell ill. A priest was needed to be with the prisoner in his last moments. The curé was sent for, but he refused to go, saying, "This is not a concern of mine. I want nothing to do with the mountebank. Anyway, I'm sick myself, and in addition, it is not my responsibility." When this reply was reported to the bishop, he said, "The curé is right. It is not his responsibility. It is mine." Immediately going to the prison, he went down into the dungeon to the mountebank, called him by his name, took him by the hand, and talked with him. He spent the whole day with him, forgetting food and sleep, praying to God for the soul of the condemned, and urging the man to join with him. He told him the greatest truths, which are the simplest. He was father, brother, friend to him, and a bishop only for the blessings. He taught him everything by encouraging and consoling him. This man would have died in despair. Death for him was like an abyss. On his feet and trembling before the dreadful abyss, he had recoiled with horror. He was not ignorant enough to be indifferent. The terrible shock of his sentence had in some way broken that wall which separates us from the mystery of things beyond and which we call life. Through these mortal breaches, he was constantly looking beyond this world and seeing nothing but darkness. The bishop showed him the light. The next day, when they came for the poor man, the bishop was with him. He followed him and appeared before the crowd in his violet robes, with his bishop's cross at his neck, side by side with the miserable creature bound with ropes. He climbed onto the cart with him, ascended the scaffold with him. The sufferer, so desolate and overwhelmed the day before, was now radiant with hope. He felt that his soul was reconciled, and he trusted in God. The bishop embraced him, and as the axe was about to fall, he said to him, "He whom man kills, God restores to life. He whom his brothers drive away finds the Father. Pray, believe, enter into life. The Father is here." When he climbed down from the scaffold, something in his look made the people fall back. It would be hard to say which was the more inspiring, his parlor or his serenity. As he entered the humble house, which he smilingly called his palace, he said to his sister, "I have been officiating pontifically." Because the loftiest things are often the least understood, there were those in the city who said, in commenting on the bishop's conduct, that it was affection. But such ideas were confined to the upper classes, the people who do not look for malice in holy works, marveled and were touched. As for the bishop, the sight of the guillotine was a shock to him, from which he recovered only slowly. Indeed, the scaffold, when it is there, set up and ready, has a profoundly hallucinatory effect. We may be indifferent to the death penalty and not declare ourselves either way so long as we have not seen a guillotine with our own eyes. But when we do, the shock is violent, and we are compelled to choose sides, for or against. Some, like Le Magistrate, admire it. Others, like Beccaria, execrate it. The guillotine is the law made concrete. It is called the Avenger. It is not neutral and does not permit you to remain neutral. Whoever sees it quakes, mysteriously shaken to the core. All social problems set up their question mark around that blade. The scaffold is vision. The scaffold is not a mere frame. The scaffold is not an inert mechanism made of wood, iron, and ropes. It seems like the creature with some dark origin we cannot fathom. It is as though the framework sees and hears. The mechanism understands, as though the wood and iron and ropes have their own will. In the hideous nightmare it projects across the soul. The awful apparition of the scaffold fuses with its terrible work. The scaffold becomes the accomplice of the executioner. It devours, eats flesh, and drinks blood. The scaffold is a sort of monster created by judge and carpenter. The specter that seems to live with an unspeakable vitality, drawn from all the death it has wrought. Thus, the impression was horrible and profound. On the day after the execution, and for many subsequent days, the bishop seemed overwhelmed. The violent calm of the fatal moment had disappeared. The phantom of social justice took possession of him. He who ordinarily looked back on all his actions with such radiant satisfaction now seemed to be filled with self-reproach. At times, he would talk to himself, muttering dismal monologues. One evening, his sister overheard and jotted down the following. I didn't believe it could be so monstrous. It's wrong to be so absorbed in divine law as not to perceive human law. Death belongs to God alone. By what right do men touch that unknown thing? With time, these impressions faded away and probably disappeared. Nevertheless, it was remarked that the bishop always avoided passing the execution square. M. Murrell could be called at all hours to the bedside of the sick and dying. He well knew that there was his highest duty, his most important work. Widowed or orphan families did not need to send for him. He came on his own. He would sit silently for long hours beside a man who had lost the wife he loved, or a mother who had lost her child. Just as he knew the time for silence, he also knew the time for speech. Oh, admirable counselor! He did not seek to drown grief in oblivion, but to exalt and dignify it through hope. He would say, be careful how you think of the dead. Don't think of what might have been. Look steadfastly, and you will see the living glory of your beloved dead in the heights of heaven. He believed that faith gives health. He sought to counsel and calm the despairing by pointing out the man of resignation, and to transform the grief that contemplates the grave by showing it the grief that looks up to the stars. Wow. That's kind of touching, hearing that. Anyway, as you see, we're kind of starting to get to know the bishop that I'm wondering how much to give away. But anyway, we're starting to get to know this bishop and get things kind of moving forward. Anyway, stay tuned for chapter 5 of book 1 of Fantine. We still have quite a bit to go. I mean, there's over, we'll get there, 1,463 pages. And it looks like there are like multiple of these bookmarks everywhere. So people have kind of started and not finished. Anyway, I wanted to thank you guys so much today for tuning in and listening to this book. You all have a wonderful, wonderful, and blessed day.